Oh,
Good
crikey.
evening, Phil.
Hi, Paul. Nice to see you.
Uh,
It's been a while, hasn't it?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So we said we'd do a video. We know each other from Isadoras, don't we?
Mm.
So
Well, that's a long time ago, isn't it? When Isadora's was around 1989, I think, wasn't it?
yeah,
And
yeah,
it wasn't around that long. It was around for about a year or so, I think, wasn't it?
yeah, yeah,
But it but it but it occupies quite a big place in my mind, and I only went there a handful of times. But it occupies quite a big place in my mind because it was like nothing I'd ever seen before
yeah,
as the nightclub, right?
yeah.
And it was like a completely different experience. So I was I should say who I am. My name's Philip Kiszely, and I'm a cultural historian and commentator, political commentator, and author and journalist. And in 1989, I was 17, going on 18. So in the August, I was 18, and I just started night clubbing and just properly kind of got onto the music and clubbing scene in Manchester. And the first club I ever went to was the Banshee, actually, on Oxford
All
Road.
right, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. There was an alternative room downstairs, and they played lots of goth and indie and grebo and that kind of thing of that
yeah,
period. But we discovered this place, Isadoras, because we knew the guys who did the slides and lighting, and there was lots of psychedelic lighting and slides of bands and 60s stuff, and it was like when you went downstairs into the club, it was like, do you remember that cartoon Mr. Ben?
yeah, yeah,
It was like stepping, and he steps into another world and he goes into this fantasy world. That was precisely what it was like. So you'd step in, and it was like stepping into 1967 or something like that.
yeah,
It was really, it was a really kind of strange kind of thing. And just at that time in the 80s, that was desperately what I wanted. I discovered 60s garage music and the Velvet Underground and the Stones and all of that kind of early psychedelia and stuff. And I loved the hedonism of it all. And it was like stepping into that world because, especially if you think about what the 80s were like, it was things like Billy Bragg and Red Wedge, and it was pretty dreadful, and AIDS,
yeah,
and all of that kind of thing. So it was an inhospitable world for a teenager, especially
yeah,
someone who was just up for it and really raring to go. You know what I
yeah,
mean? And because you were that age as well. So Isadora's was like literally like a portal into a magical world, and you'd be listening to 60s garage, you'd be listening to early Stones, Kinks, and that would be kind of teamed with things like uh, Stone Roses and the Manchester music as well, because that was all influenced by the 60s stuff.
yeah,
And it was really quite magical. And our friend Dave Booth was the DJ there,
yeah,
and
yeah,
one of the biggest names in Manchester.
yeah. Yeah, I just remember the Chocolate Watch band then when you mentioned the Stone Roses.
Yeah,
Yeah,
all of those bands, all of those 60s bands like the Chocolate Watch Band, the Seeds, the Sonics, all of the bands on the Pebbles compilations, Nuggets compilations. So all of that stuff I just discovered.
yeah,
And I was wearing paisley shirts and beetle boots and had like a bowl haircut and stuff like that. And there was loads of people kind of like-minded like that there. It was a combination of different kinds of people, actually, in Isadora's. It was, on the one hand, there were kind of like studenty kind of shoegazer types who were a bit indie and a bit kind of 60s-ish. And then there was like real Manx scallies as well,
yeah, yeah,
who, yeah, it's all that.
yeah,
And the two just mixed really, really well, And I remember just being there, and with all of this, Paul Clements, guys, he's died now. Paul, he died a few years ago, but him and a guy called Derek, I can't remember his surname, did all of the light show, and it was an amazing light show. I remember just being in there, as a 17, 18-year-old, all the girls looked beautiful, and the music was amazing, and the psychedelic light show was great. And a guy called Gino Brandolani,
Yeah. Yeah.
rap
Yeah.
kind, and it was all just a bit crazy, and it was like all of the people, everybody went to the Hacienda. Everybody from out of town went to the Hacienda, but everybody who liked music and was from Manchester went to Isadoras at weekends.
Yeah, and I think there's a misconception. Like as I'm doing these videos, I'm in all sorts of conversations. So people think 1988 and 89 Manchester, everyone was on ecstasy, and it was all house music. But ecstasy was really expensive. It was like £25 a tablet, where LSD was £2.50. And
Yeah. So that was the thing, and we're talking 35 years ago here. It's a different. We were all kids and all the rest of it, but it was just everybody you knew.
Yeah,
It was a really hedonistic scene, and so everyone took acid, which was strawberries and things like that, and Mick Jagger's, or was that ecstasy? I can't remember now. It's just a long time ago. So everyone took that, and people took speed as well.
yeah.
The combination of the two. God, which must have, because you can't metabolize it. You can't metabolize acid. So God, no wonder there was quite a few casualties after that. But I remember everybody just being happy. It was a very kind of easygoing, happy scene, actually, with those kind of people there. Everybody off the faces.
Yeah.
But I remember going. So I did the kind of clubbing stuff, and I was in a band as well, which we'll talk about a bit later, I suppose. And then I kind of left the band to go to university, and I stopped a little bit later. I was about 21, 22 when I went to university, and I stopped going out for a couple of years, and then I started going out again in kind of the mid-90s later, about 96, something like that, 97, 96. And we went to, me and my friend Mike, we went to 42nd Street. And it had changed massively in about 2 or 3 years. The scene had changed massively in about 2 or 3 years. Yeah. So I remember I had this beautiful paisley kind of vintage 1960s shirt that I put on and wore for it. And we went out to 42nd Street. We hadn't been there. It was Dave Booth, who was the DJ at Isadoras. And it was full of Oasis fans, like football fan type things. Yeah. And they were all dressed identically with these kind of Oasis haircuts, button-down shirts pulled out of their trousers, and kind of Clark shoes and stuff like that. And it was a completely different scene. And I went to, and there were still a few of, people who I knew and stuff like that, but there were all of these people, and they were all playing at being like Noel Gallagher, and I went to the bar, and I was in this beautiful shirt and stuff like that, and ordered a drink, and one of these Oasis types kind of, I love Oasis, I'm not, but one of these guys, I was just saying how different the scene was, looked around to me and said, "Hey, look at this cunt. He's only come out in his fucking pajama top." and it was like, and everybody laughed, and it was actually quite funny. So it wasn't, it diffused the situation. It was oh, fucking hell. But you never would have got that a few years earlier, because everyone was just busy being cool. You know what I mean? And what happened was that type of music, we all love the 60s stuff, it just became massively mainstream. So you had loads of mainstream people coming into that very alternative space, and that hadn't really happened before. It was really alternative, wasn't it? Then by the mid-90s, well, they were massively the biggest thing to hit the country since the bubonic plague, weren't they? So it became massive. But I always look back on that time of Isadoras in particular. It was kind of like a rite of passage for me. It was. I was 18, and I was in Manchester, and it was the center of the universe for music and culture and style and fashion and everything. And I just took it completely for granted, right? And it had been for years. So you'd had the Smiths before that, and you'd had Joy Division, and you'd had the Buzzcocks and John Cooper, all of that stuff, massive, playing massively. And then you had all of the Happy Mondays and Stone Roses and all the Manchester bands being on top of the pops and stuff like that. And there was a moment where it was the center of the universe for music. And it was round about that time. It was about 1989. And other things were happening. It was the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was, there was a sense of a real change in the air.
Yeah.
And I always associate all of that stuff with Isadoras, because it was like Wonderland to me, and it was, and that's where we hung out as kids,
It rarely got, well, it never got wrote about. And when Gino did the reunion, then I mean, he was really busy, one at the first reunion, but then there was a write up on it in the Evening News.
Yeah.
And when I read that write up, you realised how important the club it was. And Denise Johnson was there at the reunion. So
Because loads of people used to go. And I did something for it. I did something for Louder Than War, John Robb's website. Yeah. I wrote something for it, and it kind of went quite big. It went, everyone, loads of comments on it, loads of views and stuff like that. Because I was doing a similar thing. I was just talking about how important it was to me. And it's from you can link it to the Hacienda, but I think it goes back more directly to places like the Roxy Room and Pips, which was the big kind of punk club, wasn't it, really? Because that's where everybody met. So the Roxy Room at Pips was the Roxy Bowie Room, and they play, in the kind of mid to late 70s, they played Bowie, Roxy music, and then the burgeoning punk stuff, and then goth stuff and all of that kind of thing. And everybody went there. So Morrissey went there, or the Joy Division did their first gig there. The Stone Roses, when they were little kids, when they were 15-year-olds, used to sneak in there and all of that, just so everybody, Mark Smith and the hundreds and thousands of members of the Fall over the years, they all went there. You know what I mean? So it was a really important place, and for me, Isadoras is part of that trajectory, because it was all similar kinds of people, and it was all people who were really interested in music and interested in bands. And it's interesting that we talked before briefly about like an alternative history of Manchester. Everybody knows the Hacienda history of Manchester, don't they? But they don't know really about this, and they don't know about some of the other clubs, the network of clubs, Berlin and all of those clubs that were around, which loads of people went to, and which a music scene came out of.
Yeah.
Which was it was bizarre, because it was quite a big scene full of and different kinds of bands, generally playing rock and roll type based music, but it was a big scene, and no one kind of made it really, apart from Oasis. They made it.
Do you know, I always think that I mean, so Legends, before it became Fifth Avenue, yeah. I think he went on to do the Brick House, then in the DJ.
And Brick House, yeah.
Yeah, and I always think that Oasis was the playlist of Legends. It's even the last track of the night was I'm the Walrus, and that 60s thing. For me, and probably for a lot of us, I was a collector of records, so I used to buy house music. I used to buy imports and hang out in Spinned, and then I developed a love of an obsession with the 60s, which a lot of us were obsessed, weren't we?
Well, really, for the reasons I said before, I think, because a lot of the 80s, all of the happening stuff in the 80s was a kind of throwback to the 60s in a way, really.
Yeah, and you could get really like bands like the Chocolate Watch Band, and then when you mentioned it before, the Pebbles compilations, they were awesome. They were like 60s garage bands that they may have had a single that got to number 50 in the charts, mightn't they? Or they were all outside the charts, weren't they?
They were all kids in bands who had like one single, and maybe, or they'd be local in America. They'd be locally quite popular or something like that, and occasionally a band would have a national hit like the Shadows of Night or something like that, but usually they were obscure. They were really, really obscure, you know. And that was the fun of it all, because it was different. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And just discovering this stuff as a kid was fantastic. And I played in a band that played essentially kind of that kind of stuff, garage, 60s garage rock and roll, really. And it's the story of everybody on the scene at that time. So many people were in bands, but I enjoyed it massively, mainly because I met the guy who was in the band with Michael Rose. He was probably the first person I'd ever met or worked with in my orbit. I was only 17 or 18, who was actually genuinely talented. Right, he was a genuinely talented songwriter.
Yeah,
he was witty and cool and everything, but he was a genuinely talented songwriter, and I could see that at 17. You know, so we played all over the place. You know, Boardwalk and Band on the Wall, where everybody played, and there was a whole roster of groups. I've written some of the names down because I was just thinking if I could remember them. I don't know whether you remember any of these actually. The Obi Men, do you remember them? Robinson. The Wild Pansies,
I remember the Robinson.
Metal Monkey Machine,
I remember Metal Monkey Machine.
yeah, Swirl, a New Fast Automatic Daffodils, who became quite famous, I think.
What, did you play on the same bill as them?
No, but we used to rehearse next door to them.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, and the Fall used to rehearse in the same building. So all of these bands, none of whom ever really became famous apart from Oasis out of all of those bands.
Do you remember Dean and Dean and Tony? So Dean had the big hair.
Right, yeah, he was quite short. Yeah.
And he went to the reunion. Well, Roisin Murphy was
Yeah, that's right.
yeah, she was interviewed on the radio, and then she did a tweet about her first band in Stockport.
Yeah.
And I don't know, Dean was in a band with her.
Well, you know, we were all in those bands, and there were so many bands. I mean, I can't remember half of the names. I can see the people, but I can't remember the name because you just forget. But a few years ago, I was supposed to write a book. I got a publishing deal for it and everything, Intellect Books, on this alternative Manchester music scene, and in the end, I ended up not writing it. Because the publisher was fine because I was editing a journal for them, and I kind of knew them, but it was just too much to. It's nice to talk about it and it's nice to go down memory lane, but I didn't want to go back there for a year and do all the research and immerse myself in the kind of 80s and 90s. So I kind of decided not to do it really, but I did write a few things. I'm just looking at this thing now. There's a book here which is a book about Joy Division, and I wrote a chapter in that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, with Dave Booth. So we wrote that together, and that came out about 2016.
What was your chapter on?
It was called From Pips to the Hacienda: Punk, Joy Division, and Identity, and it was about the clubbing scene, really, you know.
Yeah.
And I published a couple of other things as well, but I kind of that was it then. I thought, well, I'm not gonna write anything else about that, and I started doing other things. But I think there's a book there to be done, because I think there's a whole alternative narrative to the Hacienda, which is great and amazing, and that's the successful narrative. But there's lots of other stuff as well, you know, and Isadoras is one of them, because it's one of the great lost stories. I think there's not that much done on it. I've written something on it, as you say. There was something in the Manchester Evening News about it, which I remember. That's pretty much it, really. You know, that's pretty much.
I can't remember going in there. I went to the reunion, and I thought I got it. Well, I knew people that were going, so I didn't feel too much of an imposter. So I don't remember going. And then there was a wall full of pictures.
Yeah.
And then I'm on one of the pictures.
And you're on one of them, yeah. Well, there's a reason you can't remember going. It's because you're on your time. But you know, we all. But it was an incredibly hedonistic time, wasn't it? And you know, you just go out and you just be going for it. Very different to now. But there's quite a lot of casualties, I suppose. But most people came through it. And
I was in Hotel Chocolate today in the Trafford Centre, and then I was queuing up, and then I got to the front, and then there's a sachet of chocolates called pink champagne, and it tickled me because that was like strong and speed, wasn't it? And I said to her, like, I had a smile on my face, and I said, "Oh, what's this?" And she said, "Oh, it's just chocolate liqueurs," and I felt like saying it was different in my clubbing days.
different when I were a lad.
Yeah, how much is a gram of it?
Well, it was just kind of all over the place, wasn't it? And I don't know what it's like now. I don't know what like young kids are like now. I don't know whether, I mean, you smell weed everywhere, don't you? But that's a slightly different thing. It was just, it literally was all over the place. And then I got to about 1993 or something like that, and I was kind of, by that time I was kind of suffering from party fatigue a little bit, I think, and I was just concerned about what I was going to do with my life, really, and because all I had was this band, and it felt like we were going nowhere, and all the rest
Did
of
you
it.
have any success with the band? Did you get any
We,
sellout gigs
we were always, we played Liverpool University Freshers Ball. That was big, we went down really well at that because we
yeah.
we were pretty wild. We played all over the place, quite a bit out of town, not a huge amount, but we played in London. I remember us playing in Doncaster. That was quite curiously enough, Doncaster of all places,
Yeah.
but it just stood out as a really good gig. And we played all over the place in Manchester. But I think the problem was I was only, 21, 22, and I was a bit bonkers. But I think we had it as we kind of looked quite good, as a kind of retro rock and roll band. And as I say, Mike was a brilliant songwriter, and I kind of got better at it because he essentially taught me how to do it, and I quite enjoyed like writing lyrics and stuff like that. And we were pretty good as at writing songs and stuff like that. But we didn't. If I could go back now and know what I know now, right, we'd be big, because what I know is that it's not just about talent, and it's not just about being in the right place at the right. All of those things are really important, and looking good. All of those things are really important, but the really important factor is really hard graft, right?
Yeah.
And practicing and really pushing it and taking it and working at it like a job. We never did that. So we kind of just didn't make it, and we were probably not quite right for the particular time. But I look back on it with real fondness, because there was a scene. There was a very definite scene, and it was based at Isadoras, and it was the what's its name on a Tuesday night, the Playpen, 42nd Street on a Tuesday night. And one or two other places as well, the Brick House, and it was all of that retro type stuff. And it was glorious for a few years. And then, like I say, it changed, mainly because all of that stuff became mainstream, because Oasis took exactly what we were right into the mainstream,
But what one area I'd love to cover, and hopefully I'll get to do it, but so we had a love of the 60s.
Yeah.
A lot of people, me included, would assume that there wasn't a scene in Manchester in the 60s. It was just like swinging London. But I was chatting to Alison, who does the Manchester district.
Yeah, the archive. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was
Yeah, she
looking
knows
at her
everything. Yeah.
page, and she said that actually there was more beat cafes in Manchester per square mile, I think she said, or per area, than there was in London. And there was a
Well,
thriving scene of bands and beat cafes, and I didn't know
well,
anything about that.
well, mainly because there were loads of little clubs that were in houses. Right. So in Manchester, there were loads of like terrace houses, back-to-back terrace. They're all pulled down, and then the Arndale was put up. So
Yeah,
in all of those places, there were lots of like spielers, little tiny little kind of gambling places and beat clubs that were literally in people's houses.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and people would just get lost in this warren. It was like Dickensian, warren of places, and there was a music scene. Don't forget there was the Northern Soul Club. What's it called? My mind's gone.
Twisted Wheel.
The Twisted Wheel, and there was loads of soul stuff, but there were all of these little beat places, and just they weren't really, you couldn't really call them clubs as such, because they probably close down after a week, or they get raided. And so you had there was a whole set of, the police had a specialist squad they called them the Mod Squad, and they dress up in plain clothes, and they dress in their beat gear, and they go and raid these places, because everyone was on Purple Hearts, and they were kind of quite worried about drugs. It's exactly the same scene. They're quite worried about drugs and stuff like that, and people would just disappear. So young girls would go.
Purple Hearts, would that have been amphetamines?
Yeah. So there was just that great big scene, and of course, as well, there was this was slightly later in the 70s, but George Best had that club, didn't he? Slack Alice, which
was that 42nd Street?
42nd Street, which my dad used to go to, and everybody used to go to that.
Yeah.
Jimmy Savile had the we're probably not allowed to mention him, but Jimmy Savile's had the big club on Wednesday nights on, I think it was on Deansgate. I can't remember what it was called now, but that was the biggest that was obviously the biggest show in town in the mid 60s, because it was Jimmy Savile, because he was doing Top of the Pops in Manchester, it was in Rush Hour. And so my mum used to go to that in the 60s. My mum and dad used to go to that. Oh God, there's Jimmy Savile. So there was a big scene, and of course there was Granada Television. There was Coronation Street. There were all of those stars. So it came out of all of that kind of stuff. And so Pips. Before it was Pips, it was called the Jungfrau at the end of the 60s. And then it became a club called the Nice and Easy, which played easy listening music and everybody would lounge around. And then it became Pips. And all of a sudden you've got that seed of the Manchester scene, which we then kind of grew up in the 80s. So it's all connected. It's all fantastic stuff. But yeah, it goes a lot further back than you would think it does, because because there were no major bands that came from, what was the Herman's Hermits in the 60s?
The Hollies.
The Hollies. But there wasn't, there was probably a huge scene, but they didn't, because it was all Liverpool, wasn't it? And it was all London. There was the blues scene in London. There was a Merseybeat scene in Liverpool. Maybe Manchester was kind of between the two stools there a little bit. And I think the same thing happened at the end of the 80s. Even though there were lots of bands, they didn't become successful for kind of various reasons, really. And probably actually drugs was probably a big reason why they didn't.
Yeah. I need to set a timer, mate. I always lose track of the time. I always try and aim for about half an hour.
Right.
Where are we now? So
well, I think we're getting there towards half an hour.
So I always try and end with just give me a favourite track from your Isadora's days.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Well, I've been thinking about this. I've been listening to stuff, and I think there's always kind of music that, if you're into music like we are, there's always something that kind of changes your life, I think. And so when I first started falling in love with music, I think the first band I ever fell in love with was the New York Dolls.
Yeah. You're on the video, aren't you?
Sorry?
You're on the video, aren't you?
I'm on the video, yeah. The New York Dolls.
Yeah.
When they reformed Morrissey's Meltdown. So they were the gateway into it all, if you like. And then from there, curiously enough, it's usually the other way around, but from there, I discovered the Rolling Stones.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously I'd heard the Stones before, but I'd never really listened to them. And then when I oh right, yeah, they're like the grown-up version of the New York Dolls,
Yeah.
And then going back through precisely at this time, just as I was leaving school and as I was in sixth form and I was 17 and 18, just discovering all of this 60s music of the Rolling Stones and thinking, yeah, they're my band. I love them. You know what I mean? That's maybe because I kind of look like one, and I liked the fact that they were so libertarian and hedonistic and so successful, and that's what I kind of wanted to be like. So the track is, it's She Said Yeah, and it's a cover actually, but it's She Said Yeah, and they do it from 1965, and it's just wild.
Yeah.
I think it's the start, the beginning track of Out of Our Heads, I think, and it's just wild, and it's got all of that kind of raw energy, which is that inspired the 60s garage bands. And it was played as Dave Booth, bless him, who isn't with us anymore. He played that song, and I used to dance to that song on Isadora's dance floor, and it was just like being literally like being in heaven, you know. And it was that thing. It was that part, being in another world. And Isadora's, I'll always love it because it gave. It was absolutely part of Manchester, but it also transcended Manchester as well. And it was almost like being able to not just go back in time, but it gave you a sense of being able to get out of it all and go on to do something different. It sounds really ridiculously grandiose when I say that, but I remember how I felt in 1989, and it was like, oh well, you know, the sky's the limit, you know, this is our scene and this is different and we're really cool and we all look great and the music's wonderful. And Isadora's was very much part of that, and it was lovely. It was just fantastic being a teenager and young during those days at that time at that place in Manchester. Isadora's was very much part of it.
So thanks so much, Phil. I'll just stop recording now.